The year was 519 BCE, and in the sprawling palace complex of Persepolis, a young girl named Artainte celebrated what would be her final birthday as a child. She was 12 years old, daughter of the most powerful man on earth, heir to luxuries beyond imagination. Golden bangles adorned her wrists, silk from distant lands draped her shoulders, and servants attended her every whim. By every measure visible to the outside world, she lived a life of unparalleled privilege and protection. But Artainte was not celebrating. She sat in the women's quarters, hands trembling as her mother applied ceremonial cosmetics with the precision of someone performing a sacred ritual. The kohl around her eyes was drawn to make them appear larger and more mature. Rouge painted her lips a deep crimson. Perfumed oils were massaged into her skin until she gleamed like a polished statue. Every detail was calculated, every touch deliberate, transforming a child into something else entirely. Her mother worked in complete silence, her face a mask of controlled neutrality that revealed nothing of the storm raging beneath. When the preparations were complete, she stepped back and studied her daughter with eyes that seemed to be memorizing every detail. Then came the words that would haunt Artainte forever. "Tonight, your father will summon you. You will go to his chambers. You will do whatever is required of you. You will show no fear, no resistance, and no emotion except gratitude. Do you understand what I am telling you?" Artainte nodded, though understanding remained just beyond her grasp. She had grown up watching older sisters disappear from the women's quarters when they reached a certain age, returning hours or days later with something broken behind their eyes. She had seen the pattern repeat with mechanical regularity. Each girl transformed from child to something else, something diminished. But she was his daughter. Surely that meant protection. Surely that created boundaries that even absolute power would not cross. What Artainte could not have known was that she was about to become part of a system so twisted, so fundamentally corrupt, that it would shock even the enemies of Persia when they eventually learned its full scope. She was about to discover that being the daughter of Xerxes, king of kings, ruler of an empire stretching from the Mediterranean to India, offered no protection whatsoever from the man who claimed dominion over every living soul within his borders. Subscribe to this channel right now, because what you're about to learn will fundamentally change how you understand power, corruption, and the depths to which human beings can sink when granted absolute authority. This is not just ancient history. This is a case study in how civilizations can normalize the unthinkable when it serves the interests of those in control. Hit that subscribe button and tell me in the comments what you already know about the Persian Empire, because I guarantee the reality of what happened in those palace chambers will shatter every assumption you've ever had about ancient royalty. Before I reveal the full horror of what Xerxes did to his daughters, before I explain how this practice became not just accepted, but celebrated within Persian culture, I need you to understand who Xerxes was and how he came to wield the kind of power that recognized no boundaries, no moral constraints, and no limits on his desires. Because this story isn't about a single monster operating in secret. This is about a system that created monsters and called them gods. Xerxes was born into the bloodline of kings, son of Darius the Great, grandson of Cyrus the Conqueror, who had founded the Persian Empire through military genius and ruthless expansion. His birth in 518 BCE placed him at the apex of the ancient world's greatest civilization, heir to territories that spanned 3 continents and controlled the lives of millions of people. But royal birth in ancient Persia carried expectations that went far beyond mere political authority. Persian kings claimed direct descent from Ahura Mazda, the supreme deity of their Zoroastrian faith. This wasn't symbolic or metaphorical. They literally believed that royal blood contained divine essence, that kings were living gods walking among mortals, that their desires were sacred commandments that could not be questioned or refused. This theological framework created a society where the king's will was literally divine law, where anything he chose to do became moral by virtue of his choosing it. When Darius died in 486 BCE, Xerxes had to fight for his inheritance. Persian succession wasn't automatic. It required demonstrating divine favor through political maneuvering and the elimination of rivals. Xerxes had older half-brothers who challenged his claim, men with legitimate arguments for why they should inherit the throne. But Xerxes possessed advantages that proved decisive. His mother Atossa was daughter of Cyrus the Great, giving him the purest royal bloodline, and he showed a ruthless willingness to destroy anyone who stood between him and absolute power. The succession struggle lasted 2 years and left a trail of mysteriously deceased princes, convenient accidents, and political opponents who simply vanished from historical records. By 484 BCE, Xerxes had eliminated every rival and established himself as the undisputed King of Kings, ruler of the Persian Empire at the height of its power and territorial expansion. But his father's legacy included one massive failure that haunted the new king's legitimacy. Darius had launched an invasion of Greece that ended in humiliating defeat at the Battle of Marathon in 490 BCE. Greek hoplites had proven that Persian military dominance wasn't absolute, that the supposedly invincible Persian war machine could be beaten by inferior numbers fighting on their home territory. This defeat created questions about divine favor that threatened the entire theological foundation of Persian kingship. If Persian kings were truly blessed by Ahura Mazda, if they genuinely possessed divine authority, how could they lose battles against inferior enemies? How could mortals defeat gods? These questions demanded answers, and Xerxes spent the first years of his reign preparing the most massive military expedition in ancient history to provide those answers definitively. While assembling the largest army the world had ever seen, while building bridges across the Hellespont and organizing supply lines that would sustain hundreds of thousands of soldiers, Xerxes was also consolidating his domestic power in ways that revealed the true nature of his character. He inherited his father's harem, hundreds of women who had served Darius and who now served his son. But Xerxes didn't limit himself to inherited concubines and captured beauties from conquered territories. He also claimed his own daughters. This practice wasn't entirely unprecedented in Persian royal culture, but Xerxes elevated it to new levels of systematization and openness. Previous kings had occasionally taken daughters as concubines, justifying the practice through religious arguments about preserving pure royal bloodlines. But Xerxes made it routine, expected, a regular feature of how royal power operated rather than an occasional aberration. The theological justification was sophisticated and internally consistent. If royal blood contained divine essence, then the purest possible bloodlines came from unions between people who both possessed this sacred heritage. Brothers marrying sisters, fathers with daughters, keeping the divine essence concentrated within the smallest possible circle, rather than diluting it through marriages with commoners or even with nobility who lacked direct divine ancestry. But the religious framework, however elaborate, was ultimately a rationalization for something much simpler and more disturbing. Xerxes claimed his daughters because he could, because his absolute power meant that literally no one was beyond his reach, because demonstrating control over his own family reinforced the message that resistance to royal will was impossible even for those who shared his blood. Persian culture already granted fathers enormous authority over their children, particularly over daughters whose primary value was seen as their reproductive capacity and their utility in creating political alliances through marriage. But Xerxes took this patriarchal authority to its logical extreme, claiming not just the right to arrange his daughters' marriages, but the right to use their bodies for his own pleasure before disposing of them to serve political purposes. The daughters who grew up in Xerxes' palace learned this reality gradually, watching older sisters disappear from the women's quarters when they reached puberty, understanding without being told explicitly that the same fate awaited them. Some mothers tried to prepare their daughters psychologically, explaining in careful euphemisms what would be required, teaching them techniques for psychological survival. Other mothers remained silent, either hoping ignorance might somehow provide protection, or simply unable to find words for what their children would experience. The palace eunuchs who managed the harem system became experts in preparing young princesses for their father's attention. They knew exactly how Xerxes preferred his daughters to be presented, bathed until their skin glowed, perfumed with oils that would please his senses, dressed in clothing that revealed more than it concealed, their hair arranged in styles that made them appear older and more developed than their actual age. When a daughter was first summoned, the process followed a ritual pattern that transformed childhood innocence into something else entirely. Palace servants would spend hours on preparation, applying cosmetics with artistic precision, selecting jewelry that emphasized developing curves, choosing fabrics that would respond to movement in ways designed to attract and maintain the king's interest. Every detail was calculated to maximize appeal while maintaining the fiction that what was about to happen was somehow natural and appropriate. The psychological preparation was as elaborate as the physical. Daughters were instructed on proper behavior, taught to show enthusiasm rather than fear, trained to express gratitude for royal attention rather than revealing their actual emotions. They were reminded repeatedly that they existed to serve their father's pleasure, that their bodies belonged to him by right of creation, that resistance or reluctance would be seen as ingratitude that could have consequences for their mothers and siblings. This systematic preparation reveals the institutional nature of what Xerxes was doing. This wasn't spontaneous abuse driven by uncontrolled impulses. This was calculated exploitation supported by elaborate protocols, justified through religious doctrine, and accepted by a court culture that had normalized the unthinkable by surrounding it with ceremony and theological rationalization. The daughters had no advocates, no protection, no recourse. Their mothers were themselves property of the king, powerless to intervene, even to comfort their children afterward. The eunuchs, who managed the harem, served the king's interests exclusively. The nobles who might have questioned these practices were either complicit in similar behavior with their own families, or understood that challenging royal prerogatives could result in their own destruction. What happened in those chambers when daughters were summoned remains largely hidden behind the discretion that surrounded all royal private activities. But fragments of testimony from court officials, hints in diplomatic correspondence, and occasional references in Greek historical accounts provide enough detail to understand that Xerxes treated his daughters identically to how he treated concubines and slaves, without regard for their age, their family connection to him, or their psychological capacity to process what was happening to them. The aftermath was always the same. Daughters returned from these encounters fundamentally changed, carrying knowledge that destroyed their childhood innocence and marked them for life with trauma that would shape every subsequent relationship and every future decision. Some became withdrawn and non-functional. Others adapted through psychological dissociation. A few eventually convinced themselves that what had happened was normal or even honorable. But all of them were damaged, and all of them understood that their suffering was only beginning. The true horror of Xerxes' system wasn't just what happened during those initial encounters in his chambers. It was what came afterward, when daughters who had survived that first violation discovered that their ordeal was only beginning. They learned that their father saw them not as children to be protected, but as assets to be utilized repeatedly until he decided to dispose of them for political gain. Some daughters were summoned regularly, becoming fixtures in their father's rotation of available women. They would receive the dreaded message from palace eunuchs and know they had hours to prepare themselves psychologically for another encounter. These repeated summons created a form of psychological torture that extended far beyond the physical violations. The daughters never knew when the next call would come, living in constant anticipation of trauma, unable to relax or feel safe even in the women's quarters that were supposed to be their sanctuary. Others were called only occasionally, perhaps when newer arrivals failed to satisfy the king. or when his tastes shifted toward daughters he had previously ignored. This unpredictability created its own form of torment, as these daughters never knew whether they had somehow displeased their father and fallen from favor, or whether they might be summoned again at any moment. The uncertainty prevented them from ever truly moving past their experiences or finding any sense of closure. The most devastating aspect of this system was how it destroyed the fundamental bonds that should have existed between father and daughters. These girls couldn't seek comfort from the man who had created their trauma. They couldn't appeal to paternal love or protection because their father was simultaneously their abuser and the absolute authority who controlled every aspect of their existence. They were trapped in a relationship where the person who should have been their greatest protector had become their greatest threat. The psychological mechanisms these daughters developed to survive reveal the depths of human adaptability in the face of unthinkable circumstances. Some learned to dissociate completely during encounters with their father, mentally separating themselves from their physical bodies and retreating to internal spaces where they could maintain some sense of self that remained untouched by the violations. They would stare at fixed points on chamber walls, recite prayers or poetry silently, or create elaborate fantasy worlds in their minds that provided escape from their immediate reality. Others adopted a stance of complete compliance, convincing themselves that eager cooperation might somehow minimize their suffering or earn them favor that could be leveraged for better treatment. They would study their father's preferences obsessively, learning exactly how to present themselves to please him most effectively, hoping that superior performance might lead to rewards or at least less brutal treatment during future encounters. A few daughters attempted a different survival strategy, trying to maintain some sense of agency by viewing themselves as willing participants rather than victims. They would tell themselves that serving their father's pleasure was their duty as princesses, that their suffering served the greater good of the empire, that they were making noble sacrifices for political stability. This psychological reframing allowed them to preserve some dignity and sense of purpose, but it came at the cost of acknowledging the reality of their situation. The most tragic cases were daughters who broke completely under the psychological pressure. These girls became catatonic, refusing to eat or speak, staring blankly at nothing for hours at a time. Palace physicians would be summoned to treat these episodes, but they had no understanding of trauma or its effects on the human psyche. Their treatments typically involved bloodletting, herbal concoctions, and prayers that did nothing to address the underlying psychological devastation. When daughters showed signs of complete mental collapse, they presented a problem for Xerxes beyond mere inconvenience. A princess who couldn't function properly reflected poorly on royal power, suggesting that the king's divine authority might not be as absolute as claimed. These broken daughters were typically removed from palace life entirely, sent to remote estates where they could be cared for in obscurity without embarrassing the royal family, or raising questions about what had caused their condition. The court culture that developed around these practices reveals how institutions can normalize absolutely anything when it serves the interests of those in power. Palace officials developed elaborate protocols for managing the king's access to his daughters, creating schedules that balanced his preferences with practical considerations, like the girl's physical recovery time between encounters. Eunuchs became experts in reading the king's moods and selecting which daughter would be most likely to satisfy his desires on any given evening. Medical staff learned to treat injuries and trauma without asking questions or maintaining records that might create embarrassing documentation. They developed expertise in handling situations that should never have existed, becoming complicit in systematic abuse through their professional competence in managing its physical consequences. Even the daughters' mothers, themselves victims of the harem system, were forced into complicity through their silence and their participation in preparing their children for these encounters. They could offer no protection or rescue because they possessed no power independent of the king's will. Their survival and that of their other children depended on maintaining the fiction that what was happening was acceptable, even when their maternal instincts screamed otherwise. The religious establishment that should have provided moral guidance instead created theological justifications for practices that violated fundamental human decency. Zoroastrian priests developed increasingly elaborate explanations for why kings could claim their daughters, weaving together concepts of divine bloodlines, sacred purity, and royal prerogatives into arguments that made abuse seem not just permissible, but religiously mandated. This intellectual corruption of religious doctrine demonstrates how power can co-opt even institutions that are supposedly dedicated to higher moral principles. When priests depend on royal patronage for their positions and privileges, when challenging the king means risking not just career advancement but physical survival, even religious leaders can find ways to justify the unjustifiable through sophisticated theological reasoning. The broader Persian nobility, who might have been expected to object to practices that degraded royal daughters, and by extension all daughters of noble families, instead found ways to benefit from the system. When Xerxes eventually disposed of his daughters through political marriages, he created opportunities for ambitious nobles to advance their own positions by accepting these traumatized young women as wives. These marriages served multiple functions within the corrupt system Xerxes had created. They provided rewards for loyal service, binding important nobles to the royal family through marriage ties that made betrayal more complicated and costly. They removed damaged daughters from the palace environment, where their trauma might serve as inconvenient reminders of what the king had done to them. And they created the illusion that these young women were being rescued and provided with normal lives, when in reality they were simply being transferred from one form of exploitation to another. The nobles who married these princesses understood exactly what they were receiving. They knew these young women had been used by their father for years, had been psychologically damaged by experiences that no child should endure, and would likely struggle with intimacy and trust for the rest of their lives. But they also knew that marriage to a king's daughter, regardless of her psychological state, provided enormous social and political advantages that far outweighed any personal complications. This calculated exploitation of traumatized young women for political gain reveals another layer of the systematic corruption that Xerxes had normalized. These marriages weren't rescue operations or attempts to provide the daughters with better lives. They were the final stage of a process that had begun when the girls were children, completing their transformation from human beings with inherent worth into political instruments whose only value lay in their utility to male power structures. The daughters who survived these arranged marriages faced the challenge of building relationships with men who saw them primarily as political assets rather than as individuals deserving of love and respect. Some managed to find accommodation with husbands who treated them with basic decency, creating lives that approximated normalcy, even if true happiness remained elusive. Others encountered continued exploitation from husbands who viewed marriage to damaged royal women as license for additional abuse. The children born from these marriages carried their own burden of trauma inherited through mothers who had been systematically abused and who lacked the psychological resources necessary for healthy parenting. The effects of Xerxes' practices thus extended beyond his immediate victims into the next generation, creating cycles of dysfunction that rippled through Persian noble families for decades after his death. This generational transmission of trauma demonstrates how the damage caused by systematic abuse extends far beyond its immediate victims. When an entire system normalizes the exploitation of children, when institutions develop protocols for managing abuse rather than preventing it, when religious and cultural frameworks are corrupted to justify the unjustifiable, the resulting psychological devastation spreads through families and communities in ways that can persist for generations. The scale of this institutional corruption becomes even more apparent when we examine how Xerxes used his daughters during his military campaigns, particularly the massive invasion of Greece that consumed the latter part of his reign. This expedition required enormous resources and created opportunities for the king to demonstrate his power in new ways. including through the strategic deployment of his traumatized daughters as tools of military and political policy. The Greek campaign of 480 BCE provided Xerxes with new opportunities to weaponize his daughters in ways that shocked even his own commanders. When the king assembled the largest military force the ancient world had ever witnessed, he made the unprecedented decision to bring several of his daughters along on campaign. The official explanation was that the king required familiar comforts during his conquest of Greece, that maintaining his usual lifestyle demonstrated confidence in Persian victory. But the reality was far more sinister. Xerxes had discovered that his traumatized daughters could serve as powerful tools for maintaining army morale and securing the loyalty of his most important commanders. These young women, already broken by years of abuse, now became instruments of military policy in ways that defied every concept of human decency. The logistics of transporting royal women during a military campaign were staggering. Special wagons were constructed with reinforced walls and heavy curtains to maintain the isolation that Persian royal culture demanded. Teams of eunuchs were assigned to manage every aspect of the princess's care, from their daily routines to their elaborate preparations when the king required their services. The baggage train carrying these women and their attendants stretched for miles, a massive investment of resources that demonstrated just how important Xerxes considered their presence to his campaign objectives. Princess Amestris, barely 15 years old, had already endured 3 years of her father's attention when she found herself jolting along dusty roads in a covered wagon, traveling toward what would become one of history's most famous military disasters. She had learned to recognize the signs that preceded her father's summons: the increased activity among the eunuchs, the careful selection of clothing and cosmetics, the ritualistic preparations that transformed her from a person into an object designed for royal pleasure. But during the Greek campaign, these familiar horrors took on new dimensions. Xerxes began using his daughters as rewards for exceptional military service, granting his most successful commanders private audiences with royal princesses as recognition for battlefield achievements. These encounters weren't marriages or even formal concubinage arrangements. They were temporary loans of royal flesh, treating his daughters like military supplies that could be distributed to maintain fighting effectiveness. General Artabanus, who had distinguished himself during the crossing of the Hellespont, received Princess Roxana for an entire week as reward for his engineering accomplishments. The 17-year-old princess, who had been used by her father since age 13, now found herself handed over to a grizzled military commander, old enough to be her grandfather. She was expected to show enthusiasm for this arrangement, to treat it as an honor rather than another form of violation. The psychological impact on these young women was devastating. They had already learned that their father saw them as property rather than children. Now they discovered that this property could be loaned out to strangers, that their bodies were considered appropriate gifts for men who had pleased the king through military service. The message was unmistakable. They possessed no inherent worth, no protection, no rights that couldn't be suspended whenever it served royal purposes. Commander Megabyzus earned Princess Atossa for his successful suppression of a rebellion among Greek allies who had attempted to switch sides before the Battle of Thermopylae. The 19-year-old princess had developed severe anxiety that manifested in trembling hands and difficulty breathing whenever she was summoned for royal service. These symptoms worsened dramatically when she learned she would be spending several days with a man she had never met, serving his pleasure as payment for his military effectiveness. The camp followers and common soldiers who witnessed these arrangements understood exactly what they were seeing. Royal daughters, supposedly the most precious and protected women in the empire, were being distributed like spoils of war to reward military competence. The message to the army was clear: serve the king well, and even the most forbidden pleasures might become available. Fail to satisfy royal expectations, and face consequences that extended far beyond mere professional disappointment. This systematic prostitution of his own daughters served multiple strategic purposes for Xerxes. It demonstrated his absolute power in the most visceral way possible, showing that literally nothing was beyond his authority to grant or withhold. It created intensely personal bonds between the king and his most important commanders, who now shared intimate secrets that made betrayal more complicated and dangerous. And it provided a form of reward that couldn't be duplicated by any rival claimant to royal power. The religious justifications that had been developed to explain why the king could use his daughters were now extended to cover why he could share them with others. Court priests explained that royal blood was so sacred that even temporary contact with it blessed the recipients, that commanders who had served with exceptional distinction deserved access to divine essence as recognition of their achievements, that the king's generosity in sharing his most precious possessions demonstrated the divine favor that guaranteed Persian victory. These theological contortions reveal the complete corruption of religious institutions that had once provided moral guidance to Persian society. When power becomes absolute, when kings are treated as living gods, when no institution possesses the independence necessary to challenge royal authority, even the most fundamental moral principles can be twisted to justify any practice that serves the interests of those in control. The daughters themselves had no voice in these arrangements, no opportunity to refuse or negotiate the terms of their exploitation. They learned about their assignments from palace eunuchs who delivered instructions with the same matter-of-fact tone used for any other administrative detail. They were expected to prepare themselves with the same elaborate rituals that preceded encounters with their father, to present themselves as eager participants rather than unwilling victims. Princess Fardim, who had been her father's victim since age 12, received word that she would be spending 3 days with General Otanes as reward for his successful cavalry charge that had broken Greek lines at the Battle of Plataea. She was 18 years old, had endured 6 years of systematic abuse, and now faced the prospect of being used by yet another man who saw her as a prize, rather than as a human being deserving of basic respect and protection. The practical arrangements for these encounters required elaborate planning and coordination. Separate tents were erected for the princesses and their assigned commanders, furnished with luxuries appropriate to royal status, but isolated from the main camp to maintain the discretion that Persian culture demanded. Teams of servants managed every detail, from meals to bathing facilities to the disposal of evidence that might compromise royal dignity if discovered by future historians. The commanders who participated in these arrangements understood they were being granted extraordinary privileges that came with corresponding obligations. They were expected to maintain absolute discretion about their experiences, to treat their temporary access to royal daughters as state secrets that could never be discussed openly. They also understood that their future advancement depended partly on their performance during these encounters, that satisfying royal daughters reflected their ability to manage other delicate responsibilities. General Darius, a distant cousin of the king, received Princess Artente for a full month as recognition of his successful siege of a Greek fortress that had been considered impregnable. The 20-year-old princess had developed a form of dissociative disorder that allowed her to mentally separate from her physical experiences, staring blankly ahead while men used her body for their pleasure. This psychological adaptation had helped her survive years of abuse by her father, but it created an eerie dynamic during her assignment to Darius that disturbed even the hardened military commander. The impact on army morale was exactly what Xerxes had calculated. Ordinary soldiers who learned that exceptional service might eventually earn them access to royal flesh fought with desperate intensity, hoping to distinguish themselves sufficiently to merit such extraordinary rewards. Officers competed ruthlessly for royal attention, knowing that military competence alone might not be sufficient to earn the ultimate recognition that came with temporary possession of the king's daughters. This weaponization of sexual access created a military culture that was simultaneously more motivated and more corrupt than traditional Persian forces. Commanders made increasingly risky decisions in hopes of achieving the spectacular successes that might earn them royal daughters. Soldiers committed atrocities against captured enemies to demonstrate their loyalty and their willingness to serve royal interests without moral constraints. The Greek defenders who eventually learned about these practices were horrified in ways that went beyond mere cultural differences. Even societies that accepted slavery and concubinage recognized boundaries that Persian royal culture had obliterated. The idea that a father would systematically abuse his daughters and then distribute them to subordinates as military rewards represented a level of moral corruption that challenged Greek understanding of what human beings were capable of inflicting on their own families. Herodotus, writing decades after these events, struggled to find language adequate to describe what Persian prisoners had revealed about royal practices during the campaign. His accounts, filtered through Greek cultural assumptions and limited by diplomatic discretion, still managed to convey the essential horror of what Xerxes had done to his daughters and how he had used their trauma to serve his military objectives. The princesses who survived the Greek campaign returned to Persia carrying additional layers of trauma that compounded the damage their father had already inflicted. They had learned that their suffering could always be increased, that new forms of exploitation could be invented whenever it served royal purposes, that recovery or healing was impossible as long as they remained within their father's power. Princess Mandane, who had been assigned to 4 different commanders during the campaign as rewards for various military achievements, developed a complete inability to trust any human contact. She would flinch violently when touched, even by female servants attempting to provide basic care. Her psychological deterioration was so severe that she could no longer function in normal social situations, requiring constant supervision to prevent self-harm. The failure of the Greek invasion, culminating in the naval disaster at Salamis and the land defeat at Plataea, created a crisis of legitimacy that affected how Xerxes treated his daughters after their return to Persepolis. The king, who had claimed divine favor, now faced questions about why the gods had allowed his supposedly invincible forces to be defeated by inferior Greek armies. His response was to tighten control over those aspects of his empire that remained absolutely within his power, including his traumatized daughters. The systematic abuse that had been partially concealed behind military necessity during the campaign now became more open and more frequent. Xerxes summoned his daughters with increasing regularity, as if their submission could somehow compensate for his inability to control external enemies. The young women who had hoped that their ordeal might end with their father's return to Persia instead discovered that their suffering was intensifying as the king sought to reassert his authority through the most intimate possible demonstrations of absolute power. The palace eunuchs, who managed these arrangements, noted the change in royal behavior with the careful discretion that their positions demanded. They observed that the king's treatment of his daughters had become more violent and more psychologically cruel, but they recorded these observations only in the most oblique terms that would protect them from royal displeasure, while documenting the escalating abuse for whatever purposes such records might eventually serve. The daughters themselves had no outlet for their trauma, no possibility of escape or rescue, no hope that their circumstances might improve. They existed in a state of perpetual victimization that was normalized by everyone around them, justified through religious doctrine, and supported by the entire institutional structure of the Persian Empire. Their suffering had become so routine that it was considered merely another aspect of how royal power operated, no more remarkable than taxation or military conscription. But the psychological damage that Xerxes had inflicted on his daughters would eventually contribute to the internal weaknesses that made the Persian Empire vulnerable to external conquest. The traumatized women, who were married off to Persian nobles, carried their dysfunction into the next generation, raising children who grew up in the households marked by psychological instability and damaged relationships. The corruption that had infected the royal family gradually spread through the Persian aristocracy, creating a ruling class that was internally fractured and psychologically compromised. The Greek campaign had revealed these internal weaknesses to external enemies who recognized that the Persian Empire, despite its vast resources and military power, was fundamentally unstable at its core. The practices that Xerxes had used to maintain control over his own family had created patterns of abuse and exploitation that extended throughout Persian society, weakening the bonds of loyalty and trust that any stable government requires. The king, who had sought to demonstrate his absolute power through the systematic abuse of his daughters, had instead created conditions that would eventually contribute to the destruction of everything he had tried to protect. The trauma he had inflicted in pursuit of control had generated the very instability and weakness that would make his empire vulnerable to conquest by enemies who understood that societies which normalize the unthinkable inevitably destroy themselves from within. The daughters who survived their father's systematic exploitation faced an even more sinister fate when Xerxes decided their usefulness as personal victims had run its course. These young women, already shattered by years of abuse, now became pawns in elaborate political schemes that would demonstrate the king's creativity in finding new ways to destroy human dignity while serving his strategic interests. Princess Artainte, now 19 and bearing the psychological scars of 7 years as her father's victim, found herself at the center of a plot so twisted that it would shock even the Persian court's jaded sensibilities. Xerxes had been observing his most trusted general, Artabanus, commander of the royal bodyguard, and the man responsible for protecting the king's life. This general's loyalty was unquestionable, his military competence beyond dispute, but Xerxes understood that absolute power required more than mere professional competence from those in positions to threaten royal security. The king devised a scheme that would bind Artabanus to the royal family through bonds so intimate and so compromising that betrayal would become psychologically impossible. He would offer the general marriage to Princess Artainte, an honor that could not be refused without insulting royal dignity. But before completing this marriage arrangement, Xerxes implemented a twist that revealed the absolute depths of his moral corruption. The story of Xerxes and his daughters stands as perhaps history's most chilling testament to how absolute power corrupts absolutely. What began as divine kingship became systematic destruction of the most sacred bonds humanity recognizes. These young women, born into unimaginable privilege, discovered that their royal blood offered no protection from the very man who should have cherished and defended them above all others. The Persian Empire eventually fell, conquered by Alexander's forces, who found a civilization so internally corrupted by the practices we've examined that it collapsed from within before external enemies delivered the final blow. The daughters of Xerxes, those who survived, carried their trauma into marriages that spread dysfunction through generations of Persian nobility, creating the very weakness that would doom their father's legacy. Their suffering reminds us that power without moral constraints inevitably destroys everything it touches, including those it claims to protect. In our modern world, where authority still seeks to justify the unjustifiable, these ancient voices cry out across 25 centuries, warning us that no institution, no matter how sacred, no leader, no matter how powerful, should ever be granted the absolute authority that transforms protectors into predators and reduces human beings to instruments of political will.